Hi, Joel. My name is Allison. I'm 36 years old, and at the end of 2018, I decided to start my own business. You can call it basic if you want, but I've always been passionate about cutting and styling hair. I was the oldest of 6 girls, and we grew up in a very poor household, so not only did I have to learn to cut hair, but I needed to get good at it if I was going to keep myself and my sisters from being the laughingstock of the whole town. It was a skill I continued to practice until way into my high school and college years, but it wasn't a passion so much as a in-demand skill that I had. It was only years later when I started working in an office environment that I started to realize how much I really missed it. By the time I was an adult, my sisters, friends, and coworkers could all afford to go to professional stylists, so I just wasn't being pestered to do it anymore. For a while, it was a relief, but after 18 months working in mind-numbing, boring office job stuff, I was starting to lose my mind. Now, long story short, I realized that I actually missed cutting people's hair, and that I actually enjoyed the process of it. It wasn't so much the actual cutting and styling, although it is kind of therapeutic once you know what you're doing. It's how happy a good haircut makes a person, regardless of their age or gender. Something so small can make someone's whole day, make them feel like the best version of themselves. Sure, it wasn't curing cancer or anything like that, but it was a way to make people feel good about themselves while making enough money to build towards a brick-and-mortar business. Suddenly, I went from being a despairing commuter to an excited young entrepreneur, and over the next year or so, my business continued to grow and thrive. I specialized in home visits, which more often than not involve folks that can't otherwise get to a salon or barber. That means a lot of older and disabled folks on end-of-life care. Maybe only 1 in 10 of my clients was some wealthy suburbanite who wanted the convenience of a home visit. Most others didn't have the choice. But then, the big pandemic hit, and my business was hit hard. Thankfully, I didn't have too much overhead at that stage, which meant that I didn't go bankrupt, and I was also lucky enough to have a means of supplementing my income. A friend told me about an agency who organized cleaning staff for office buildings and serviced apartments, and with the demand for deep cleaning going through the roof, there was plenty of work to go around. The company was super sketchy, mostly paid in cash, and you had to buy all of your own equipment, but money was money, and boy did I need it. So, almost every morning for nearly a whole year, I showed up at some dingy little office in the north end of town and was given a handful of addresses that I needed to visit, then went off either alone or in a group to clean wherever needed cleaning. Probably as some way of scamming the IRS, this company treated us as private contractors and paid us by the square foot. But then if you actually got a largest apartment all to yourself to clean, you could actually make quite a lot of money in just a few hours of work. It wasn't almost as much as I had been making as a stylist, but it was what I needed to survive until I could follow my dreams again. So one day, I showed up at the office, got my jobs for the day, then headed off in my car to the first address. First 2 jobs were kind of small, but then when I arrived at the third address, I found it was way bigger than the other 2. Considering the neighborhood it was in, I should have known the building would be as fancy as it was, but I was still taken aback when I actually saw the place. The penthouse suites at the top looked like they cost more money than I'd ever make in 2 lifetimes, and even the lobby looked like it could have been a fancy hotel. I had to introduce myself to a doorman just to get inside the place, and then once I was inside, another employee offered to guide me to the floor in the elevator. His name tag said Carl. He was a real nice guy, and we chatted on the ride up as I wondered who might actually live in a place like this. That question stayed with me long after I should have forgotten about that third apartment. Back then, I'd have killed to know which actors or sports stars actually lived there. But now, I don't think that I do want to know what kind of people call that place home. We went all the way up to the 5th floor, but these places were walk-up apartments, so the building was way taller than that suggests, and the apartments were huge. I was given a temporary keycard by one of the staff, and after using it to open up the apartment that I was set to clean, my jaw just dropped to the floor. It was the single most opulent, luxurious living place that I'd ever witnessed with my own eyes. And it was trashed, and it did not smell good. It looked like someone had thrown the party of the century in that place, the kind of party only stupidly rich people could throw. There were empty bottles of champagne everywhere, All kinds of fancy little snack things just going bad on countertops. There were even, clothes all over the place, too. Odd items at first, then more revealing things, all leading me to believe that, for some folks, it had been a very wild party. Usually the tenant leaves some kind of note detailing what they wanted clean, but his place had nothing, and the agency didn't mention anything special about a party that I needed to clean up after. I know this sounds like a nightmare, but it wasn't. I could just take a few pictures on my phone, spend all day cleaning the place, then take home a lot more money in hourly pay than I would have done otherwise. Sure, I'd no doubt encounter some pretty gross surprises in the process, but I was in dire need of the cash, and such a huge mess presented a pretty gross but super lucrative opportunity for me. So, I took my pictures, sent them over to the agency oh no, I'm gonna be here all day, then got to work cleaning the place. I remember thinking how that party must have been wild. Every empty bottle was some sort of bougie liquor or beer, and there was a lot of evidence of hard drug use, and almost everything that had once been in a shelf, in a box, or in a cabinet had either been knocked over or straight up tossed on the floor. I remember seeing dozens of little glass chess pieces, a few of them chipped from where folks had stood on or kicked them. They must have been worth hundreds of dollars, but there they were, all smashed and damaged, like replacing them was just no big deal. The kitchen was similarly trashed as the living area, and that's when I realized that the party hadn't taken place the previous night, or the night before that, or any other time in the previous week. There was all this super old-looking party food laid on the countertops, and it was all so rotten that it was literally festering. I mean, things were moving around in some of these moldy blobs that used to be canopies, and I realized what the bad smell was. I'm not exactly the squeamish type, but the smell was so god-awful that it had me gagging for a second. And thank God I had 2 masks on at the time, and I put both of them on before tackling that hot mess. But even with 2 masks, I could still smell all that rot, and I swear a lesser woman would have puked more than once getting it all into trash bags. Everything had been relatively normal up until that point. Well, as normal as you could get for the disgusting aftermath of some glitzy party. But they only started to get really weird when I opened up the refrigerator. Inside were yet more bottles of booze, either unopened or corked, and a bunch more of those fancy little hors d'oeuvres things, considerably less decayed than the unrefrigerated stuff. But what really caught my attention was the little cardboard tray that looked very familiar to me. I had a friend back in middle school who used to be a diabetic, and she kept all of her insulin in this little fridge in miniature glass bottles. I understand the technology is very different these days, and most folks use a special pen, but back in the day, her parents had to load up an actual syringe from a glass bottle. I know whatever was in that plastic tray was some kind of medicine or drug, but I have no idea which one. It sure didn't say insulin on any of those bottles, but being a familiar concept, I didn't find it all that suspicious. Someone at the party probably had some kind of medical condition and needed medication on hand for it. I mean, it's a simple enough explanation, right? But what didn't have a simple explanation were the Polaroid pictures scattered all over the apartment. They all depicted the various antics of the night before, and as raucous as the aftermath might have made the party seem, the pictures made it look kind of wholesome. They showed what looked like a lot of old friends drinking and dancing and smiling and laughing. But then, as I started to find more and more of them during the second phase of cleaning, it was almost like you could pinpoint the moment when things started getting weird. Keep in mind that I was finding these at random. It wasn't like an old-style flip book or a photo album or anything like that. But the more I found, the more I was able to piece together what the party looked like as the night went on. I started seeing a lot of drug use in the pictures, all kinds of stuff too, and the more people took, the more that happy look in their eyes got replaced with something a little darker. People started to look meaner, lewder, even scary. I guess at some point people started to dress up in costumes because I started seeing a lot of folks wearing all kinds of different masks, you know what I mean? And some of them were really pretty, expensive looking too. But then some of them were so ugly and demonic looking that they just gave me the creeps, really. I then found a few shots of a girl crying. Not unusual at a big messy party like that, but still upsetting to see. I found another photo where it looked like someone was trying to comfort her, but then, on closer inspection, I think they were actually laughing in the girl's face. I tossed that one into the trash bag that I was holding with contempt, realizing that I was cleaning up after some real jerks. Dumb teenagers making a mess like that is understandable, but there was something different about these people. There was something wrong with them. I tried not to look at any more of the Polaroids as I cleaned the rest of the ground floor, and it took me about 4 hours to actually get the place good as new. I took a little break, went to get lunch, and then came back renewed to get started on the second floor. I decided to take my time with it too, because whatever waited for me up there had to be way worse than what I'd already cleaned downstairs. Arriving back, I swapped a little small talk with the employees, put on a podcast once I was back in the apartment, then walked to the stairs to face the music. I figured that it'd be bad up there, and God, was I right. The bathroom was in just this disgusting condition. There was no poop at all, thankfully, but there was a lot of other stuff that I didn't feel comfortable being anywhere near without a pair of very thick rubber gloves. I decided to swallow the frog, as they say, and get the bathroom cleaned up first before I moved on to both the master and guest bedrooms. It was gag-worthy, and I realized that I'd made a terrible decision to eat lunch before tackling it first, but I powered through and got her done before moving on to the guest bedroom. Upon walking into the guest room, I knew that there had been some type of bad juju going on there the night before. There were all these gross-looking toys all over the room, empty baggies next to the bed, and there was broken wine glasses on the floor next to what looked like a few flecks of blood, honestly. It looked like an accident, but then there was just a bunch of other stuff in the room that gave me really bad vibes, and made me think that something else might have happened. And that's about the same time that I noticed that one of the toys wasn't quite like the others. It was carved out of wood, with these sharp, jagged edges on all sides, and the design carved into it showed scenes that looked like they could be depictions of hell. It was always an irrational fear of mine that I was going to clean up evidence of some kind of crime. Not like a pool of blood or anything like that, but fibers or other DNA or something. And here I had actual blood in the bedroom after some wild party, and thinking about it made me more suspicious by the second. I decided to not clean anything else until I checked the master bedroom. I felt a smidgen overdramatic as I did it, don't get me wrong, but I went ahead and did it anyways. The first thing I noticed about the master bedroom is that it actually looked like it had been spared most of the chaos elsewhere. I guess the homeowner was smart enough to lock the door or something else, because aside from the bed having been used for God knows what, the only mess I could see were a bunch of Polaroids scattered all around the room. I was low-key relieved to see that there wasn't a dead body in there, and also relieved that there seemed to be very little the way of trash to clear up. It seemed like the bloodstain was just an accident, and that I might actually be out of that place sooner than expected. So before I headed down for some hydrogen peroxide for the bloodstain in the guest room, I figured that I'd pick up the Polaroids and straighten up the bed so I could just tick off the master bedroom as being cleaned. Thing is, I didn't finish cleaning that big fancy apartment. I didn't even finish with the master bedroom, because after I picked up the first couple of Polaroids, and the picture began to build of what had happened in that room, everything changed, and it changed fast. Remember I told you about the girl who was crying in the pictures downstairs, and then how it looked like some idiot was just laughing at her? It's the same girl as in the photographs from the bedroom, and she's still crying, only she's surrounded by some of the same masked creeps from the Polaroid I saw downstairs. They're touching her, grabbing her, pulling her hair in some pictures, and she went from upset to looking downright terrified in just a few pictures. I found another Polaroid where it looked like a few of the masked men were dragging her somewhere. She was all blurry where I guess she was just struggling, and I recognized the furniture from the master bedroom, so I knew that it must have been taken almost right where I was standing. I frantically started to sift through the rest of the Polaroids, arranging them on the bed to try and find out what happened to the crying girl after the masked men grabbed her. Slowly but surely, I found the photos that I needed, and I felt sick when I worked out what they'd done to her. It was all in still frames, not much to go on, but her fate was painfully clear. The guys in the masks had dragged her over to an open closet, Then I audibly gasped as I saw them force her into the small-looking trunk. There wasn't a picture of them actually closing or locking the thing, but they must have had to fold her up like an origami if she was actually going to fit in there. But then the next thing, I'm finding a Polaroid of the trunk, closed and padlocked, presumably with the girl still inside. And that's when I realized that I was standing right in front of the same closet shown in the photos, and after reaching out with a shaking hand, I opened it up, praying that locked trunk wouldn't be waiting for me on the other side. But it was, and it broke me. I remember just running to the apartment's plug-in phone, but I couldn't work out how to call down to the desk, so I ended up running to the elevator and hammering the G button, then almost having a panic attack on the way down, hyperventilating. I burst into the lobby shouting, "Bolt cutters, call the cops, I need bolt cutters and 911. The bolt cutters were locked up in the janitorial closet, but one of the building staff had a claw hammer that he kept around for minor repairs, so he grabbed that and went back up to the apartment to smash the padlock off the trunk. Watching the guy smash the lock off felt like it lasted forever. I mean, I know whoever was in there probably wasn't alive. They must have been in there for days, but there was always still a chance that they were still there, still a chance we could bring them back from the brink of death. After showing him the Polaroids, we were both calling out, "Hello, are you still alive? Hello?" But there was no response from inside the box. I could tell from the way that it was moving that there was still something inside, but it sounded dry as it shifted around inside. Finally, the padlock's metal link popped off after one of the guy's strikes, and I braced myself for whatever we were about to find inside. When the guy swung open the lid, I caught a quick glimpse of folded-up limbs before I covered my eyes and turned away. I expected the employee I was with to do the same, but his reaction wasn't as anything like I'd expected it to be. Instead of a horrified, "Oh my God," or anything like that, he just sounded confused. I turned back and saw that it wasn't a dead body that had been cramped up in the trunk. It was pieces of a mannequin, all picked apart and separated. We had to double-check the Polaroids to make sure that we'd seen the girl getting forced into the trunk, and we did. But then they must have let her out before tossing the broken-up mannequin in there. I can't tell you how much relief that was, but we were both still so shaken up from the panic that it hardly seemed like a moment to celebrate. We knew we had to get out of there to preserve whatever was left of any forensic evidence, and the employee called the cops right away when we got back down to the lobby. I figured that I should stick around to tell them what I saw, but I waited almost an hour afterwards and no one showed up. In the end, I had to leave before the cleaning agency's office closed, otherwise I wouldn't be able to collect my money until the following morning. But I gave the employee my contact details before I left, expecting the cops to be in touch soon, because why wouldn't they investigate something so messed up? But then, one day went, and then another, and then another, until I realized the cops weren't going to call. I even stopped by the building to talk to the employees, but the doorman wouldn't let me in without a good reason. I then called the front desk from my phone and asked if the nice man that I dealt with was still there. Carl came to the phone, and as much as it was great to hear his voice, the news wasn't good. He'd called the cops a second time after I left, and once again they assured him that they'd send someone along to take a look. But just like the first time we called, Carl waited, and no one showed. He then brought the whole thing up to the building manager, who basically told him he'd be fired if he didn't stop harassing tenants. It was Carl who told me that I should probably just let the whole thing go. It was just a crazy party thrown by some dumb rich idiots who didn't really lock a girl in a trunk for a few weeks, even though it really did look that way. I started to think that maybe he was right, that maybe I was just stressed about money and had overreacted. I mean, seeing how people could just waste money like that, maybe it got to me subconsciously and I just wanted to paint them as bad people. I could have probably convinced myself of that if I hadn't seen the Polaroids, if I hadn't seen the tears and the terror of that girl's face. Part of me just knows that they kept her in there long enough that even if she did get out alive, she wouldn't be the same again. Whoever owns that apartment likes trapping people in small spaces. It's like their thing, you know? And that's why they keep that mannequin in there. I had a crazy thought once, thinking that the partygoers were a cult that had used magic to turn that poor girl into a mannequin. That sounds like something a hacky horror writer might dream up. But on the other hand, a very rich individual using their money and influence to live out their sadistic fantasies away from prying eyes. I don't think there's anything remotely unrealistic about that, do you? I don't know if any of y'all will find this scary or whatever, but for me, I think this made for one of the scariest, soul-crushing thoughts of my whole life. Many years ago now, I had to head over to my grandmother's place to help her clean up. She was getting on a little, and although she seemed as sharp as she ever was, she was having a few mobility issues, so we used to help her clean her place and cook for herself. Being one of the better cooks among us, I tended to stick to making her meals with my husband, and brother-in-law took to cleaning the house. So it was me that started to notice that certain pots and pans kept going missing every week. I brought it up with Grandma, asking where all of her pots and pans were going, but she told me that she didn't know, and offered me money to buy her new ones. I do just that, but then as the weeks go by, those pots and pans go missing too. Next thing we know, hubby can smell a weird burnt smell outside the guest room, and when he looks in, there are all the pots and pans, but burned right off them. Grandma was going senile, and she was putting things on to cook or boil or what have you, then just forgetting about them. And then she was so scared of us finding out, she didn't put them in the trash, but was also incapable of thinking of a good hiding place, so she just tossed them in the guest room. Grandma was scared. She was scared of losing her mind, and she didn't want to address it. And because Grandma was scared, I got scared for her. I got scared for myself too, wondering if I was going to end up sitting in a chair all day, staring into space and drooling while trying to remember who I am. Or if Grandma was going to end up like that, and how it was going to break my heart to have to explain who I was to her at the start of every single visit. What followed was very emotional for all involved. It wasn't a discussion Mom wanted to have, and because of that, it turned into a confrontation that ended in tears. Sad tears. Tears of despair even, but at least we could cry them together, and not alone. After my grandma died, my dad enlisted mine and my brother's help to clean out her place. Growing up on a North Carolina farm, she was able to take French in high school, apparently because my great-grandparents insisted on it being available in the local school to give the kids a sense of culture. Turns out, her French class did a bunch of correspondence exchanges with other French-speaking countries, and Grandma managed to get herself a pen pal in France who was about the same age. Their letters seemed real cute, and I don't speak a lot of French, but I knew enough to work out roughly what they were saying. And then I saw the dates, spring and summer of 1940, and I realized Grandma's pen pal was writing from northeastern France. Around the summer, I started seeing mentions of war, and then in the last letter my grandma received, I read the words in French, which translated to, "The Germans are very close now." And that was the last letter. The last one we found, anyway. It still gives me chills to think about my grandma having to deal with that as a kid. Back in 2015, 66-year-old Sumio Sanaga disappeared from his hometown of Katsugai, Japan. He had been living with his two siblings in the country's southern Aichi prefecture and was not considered to be at risk. So instead of immediately reporting Sumio missing, his siblings waited until the following year to inform authorities of his disappearance. A preliminary search of the surrounding area yielded no clues to Sumio's whereabouts, and despite extensive interviews with friends and neighbors, the investigation into his disappearance made little progress. For 5 long years, Sumio's siblings left his bedroom untouched. They claimed to have taken a brief look through his belongings, but found no clue to his location among them. For a while, they held out hope for his safe return, but as the years went by, their hope dwindled, and they began to accept that Sumio wasn't coming home. Finally, after more than half a decade, Sumio's brother and sister accepted that their big brother was gone and decided to clear out his bedroom. Sumio had been something of a hoarder, and his siblings were faced with a Herculean task in cleaning out his room, but after arming themselves with a veritable arsenal of disinfectants, they entered his bedroom and got to work. Yet almost immediately they were faced with a truly horrifying sight. Lying on the floor, out of sight of the room's doorway, was a human skeleton. Sumio's siblings immediately contacted the police and were horrified to discover that it belonged to their missing brother. They had been completely oblivious to the fact that they had been living in the same house as their brother's corpse for 5 long years. Yet puzzlingly, the Sanaga house was very small, even by Japanese standards. It seems impossible 2 people could live in a place like that without detecting the stench of decomposing flesh. It was also extremely suspicious that Sumio's siblings hadn't discovered his body during the initial search of his bedroom. They claimed to have gone through Sumio's belongings, searching for clues to his disappearance. These belongings had been strewn all over his bedroom, so how they failed to spot his corpse during the search is nothing short of baffling. When it was discovered that Sumio had passed away of natural causes, his siblings were essentially cleared of all suspicion. But as many investigators have pointed out, this doesn't exactly preclude their involvement. You see, Sumio Sanaga was actually the owner of the home, and it was no secret that the 3 siblings resented having to share such a small space. There's a good chance that Sumio's brother and sister knew he was suffering from some kind of life-threatening medical problem, and they certainly would have heard him hit the floorboards when he collapsed. Detectives began to suspect that Sumio's siblings simply allowed their older brother to die, possibly as a means of freeing up more room in the house. There was also evidence that Sumio's corpse had been tampered with, as his skeleton lay in a position that detectives felt was unnatural. Given that it was found naked, some began to speculate that Sumio's body had been stripped of clothing, either before or after his death, simply as a means of saving money on new clothes. It's also believed that once they allowed their brother to die, Sumio's siblings realized that a funeral would be very costly. So to save expenses, they could just let him decompose in his bedroom, then dispose of whatever remained in the future once it was easier to deal with. It made for a very preposterous allegation, and it was extremely unlikely that a Japanese court would convict Sumio's brothers of any kind of crime. They staunchly denied allowing their brother to die, claiming that only those with the blackest of hearts could simply stand by and listen to their loved one expire. Yet shockingly, Japan has a long and storied history of such things, so much so that the murder or abandonment of the elderly has its own special name. The word oboste translates to abandoning old woman, but the practice is also referred to as oboste or oyoste, which means to abandon a parent. Legend has it that in times gone by, elderly people of a variety of cultures were forced to sacrifice themselves so as not to be a burden on their friends and families. In ancient Japan, the elderly and infirm were sometimes carried to a mountain or some other remote, desolate place, then left there to die. The practice apparently stems from an ancient Buddhist folktale in which a son carries his mother up a mountain on his back. During the journey, she stretches out her arms, catching the twigs and scattering them in their wake, so that her son will be able to find the way home. The story was commemorated in the following poem. In the depths of the mountain, whom was it for the aged mother snapped, one twig after another? Heedless of herself, she did so, for the sake of her son. According to the Kodansha Illustrated Encyclopedia of Japan, uba-stay is the subject of legend but does not seem ever to have been a common custom. However, the train station in Nagano Prefecture is named after the practice, and one of the largest mountains in the same region has been nicknamed Uba-stay Yama, which directly translates to Mountain of Abandoned Old Women. Japanese historians have attempted to downplay the role that uba-stay has played in Japanese society, but it seems highly unlikely that a place would earn such a nickname unless the practice was commonplace, at least at one point in time. It certainly seems to have entered the Japanese national consciousness, enough so that Sumio's siblings would see it fit to abandon him during his time of need. It hardly seems important whether it was a sense of tradition and honor that led Sumio to rot in his own bedroom, or simply callousness and greed. But the horrifying fact is that when he needed them most, Sumio's siblings, people he'd been close to for his whole adult life, simply chose to let him die, cold and alone, more of a burden than a brother. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Torrevieja is a small resort town near the eastern Spanish city of Alicante. It's a major hub for international tourism, with just 80,000 year-round residents welcoming over 500,000 visitors every single year. Like most other Spanish resort towns, Torrevieja is home to a number of expats, people who pack up their lives in their home countries to start new ones in often sunnier climates. Only around 60% of the year-round residents are Spanish, and the rest are a smattering of English, German, Swedish, Eastern European, and South Americans. The eclectic mix of languages and cultures certainly makes for a diverse cultural tableau, but as local law enforcement will tell you, it can present a number of obstacles to criminal investigations. Each cultural enclave can be deeply protective of its own, and detectives have described being met with impenetrable walls of silence during their work. In that kind of environment, lawlessness can survive, and that puts everyday people in a great deal of danger. On July 16th of 2020, a 58-year-old cleaning lady was working in an apartment building on Torrevieja's Pascual Street. It was just before 7 o'clock in the evening, and the woman had almost finished her shift at the apartment block. Yet just before she was due to depart, a young man walked into the building and changed her life forever. Without saying a word, the man grabbed her by the neck, punched her in the face, then stabbed her repeatedly in the shoulders and the back of the neck. Luckily, her screams of terror alerted one of the apartment building's residents, who came rushing to her aid. This resident managed to scare off the attacker, but despite being brave enough to chase him down the street, the attacker managed to escape. Emergency services rushed to the scene of the attack, and thankfully, none of the cleaning lady's injuries proved life-threatening, but even so, the damage had been devastating. She suffered a broken nose along with 20 stab wounds her attacker had inflicted, and given that some of these were to the rear of her neck, it's nothing short of a miracle that she survived. The doctor who applied stitching to her wounds was almost certain that there'd be permanent spinal damage, but aside from nicking a few minor nerve endings, the cleaning lady had somehow avoided any kind of life-changing injury. Once she was able, the police conducted an interview with the woman, who preferred not to be named in the media. She claimed that she couldn't get a good look at her attacker, but they didn't suspect that it was anyone she knew. However, the Good Samaritan who came to her aid was able to give a much more detailed description, stating that they were a bald Caucasian male of medium height and athletic build, between the ages of 25 to 35. The witness also stated that the attacker had been wearing sunglasses, a striped white and navy blue t-shirt, denim shorts, and white sneakers. While the identity of the attacker remains a mystery, one thing was abundantly clear. They hadn't attempted to engage in any kind of robbery or further violation, and no words were exchanged prior to the attack, meaning their sole intention had been to kill. In the weeks that followed, the local community was horrified by police reports suggesting the killer was motivated by perverse, antisocial impulses. The public was also gripped by the fact that the attack had been interrupted, and the Spanish media fueled their obsession with what might have happened had it been allowed to continue. The public's morbid obsession with the case generated a great outrage, leading to tens of thousands of euros being poured into the investigation. Yet despite an extensive hunt for the killer, no suspects were identified, and no one was ever arrested. It's almost been 3 years since the random and savage attack, and in all likelihood, it's only a matter of time before someone so dangerously disturbed chooses to strike again. Torrevieja will prove rich pickings for a predator like that, being a place where people are only passing through for a short period of time. Perhaps true crime aficionados should keep an eye out on the town of Torrevieja, because next time, the knife-wielding maniac might just finish what he started. On January 2nd of 1935, a man calling himself Roland T. Owen checked himself into the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. The receptionist who took Roland's reservation later described him as being in between his late 20s or early 30s, with brown hair and a scar over his right ear. He didn't appear to have any luggage in his possession and carried only a hairbrush, comb, and toothpaste in his pocket. Then, when it came to his choice of hotel room, Roland specifically asked for an interior room, several floors up. Roland was booked into room 1046, and he quickly ran into a young lady named Mary Soptic, who would be his maid for the duration of his stay. Roland gave her full permission to clean his room, asking only that she not lock the door behind her because he was waiting for a friend. Mary later noted that Roland kept the room's blinds tightly drawn, keeping the room dark aside from one small dim lamp. Other members of the hotel's staff noticed the same thing upon their visits to room 1046, and also observed that Roland seemed to be deathly afraid of something. At around 4 p.m. on the day Roland checked in, Mary Soptic returned to his room with some fresh towels, only to find him lying on the bed in pitch darkness. Mary wasn't sure if Roland was sleeping or not, but to be on the safe side, she crept over to the table, placed the towels down in silence, then exited the room again. Yet on her way out, she noticed a handwritten note on Roland's bedside table, and it read, "Dawn, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait." It seemed like an odd note for someone to write if they intended to have a nap, but things were about to get much, much stranger at the hotel president. The following day, Mary Soptic returned to Roland's room in order to clean it. She quickly noticed that the door had been locked from the outside and assumed Roland had locked it after he left. Using her own key, she unlocked the door and walked inside, but to her surprise, there was Roland, sitting in the darkness. After giving Mary permission to clean the room, Roland took a call on his hotel's phone. Mary later stated that he said, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry, I just had breakfast." Mary also said he repeated the phrase, "No, I'm not hungry," several times, to the point it started to sound very, very odd indeed. Still holding the phone, Roland began to ask Mary about her job as she continued to clean the room. She later mentioned how he wanted to know if she was responsible for the entire floor, and if the president was a residential hotel which housed long-term guests. Mary tried to be as helpful as possible, and answered all of Roland's questions as best she could, but still, she found his intense curiosity to be odd, especially considering that most of the hotel's guests chose never to talk to her at all. Later that evening, when Mary returned with more towels, she claimed to have heard 2 male voices coming from inside the room. When she knocked on the door, she heard a loud, deep voice ask, "Who is it?" Then she explained that she had fresh towels, and the voice replied, "We don't need any." Mary knew for certain that there wasn't a single towel in the room, dry or otherwise, as she had taken them herself in the morning. What's more, the responding voice didn't sound like Roland at all. Suspicious but not wanting to cause any trouble, Mary left the room alone. The next morning, one of the hotel's switchboard operators came on shift at 7 a.m., only to notice that Roland's phone had been off the hook for quite some time. Concerned for the guest's well-being, the operator then sent a bellboy to go check up on Roland to see if he needed any assistance. When the bellboy arrived at room 1046, he noticed it had a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. However, given that he was under strict instructions to perform a welfare check, the boy knocked on the room several times before hearing a voice say, "Come in, turn on the lights." The boy tried but found the door was locked, and Roland seemed to ignore his request to unlock the room. Concluding that Roland was either drunk or half asleep, he decided to try again in an hour or so. Then, at around 8:30 a.m., the hotel's switchboard operator noticed that room 1046's phone was still off the hook, and sent another bellboy to the room in order to check on the guest. This bellboy, named Harold Pike, opened the room to find Roland lying naked on the bed. The phone was off the hook because it had been knocked to the ground somehow. So, assuming that Roland was indeed drunk, he replaced the phone's receiver, then crept out of the room again. Strangely, between 10:30 and 10:45 a.m., room 1046's phone again came off the receiver, and this time, the original bellboy was once again sent to investigate. By this time, the hotel's staff were growing irritated with Roland, who had already gained a reputation as being a rather annoying guest. The bellboy expected yet more inebriated antics on entering the room, yet the sight that greeted him was one of pure horror. On the floor in front of him was Roland's unconscious body, and almost every visible surface was drenched in blood. Quote, "When I entered the room, the man was within 2 feet of the door on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands," the boy later told police. "I saw blood on his head. I then turned the light on. I looked around and saw blood on the walls, on the bed, and in the bathroom. This frightened me, and I immediately left the room and went downstairs." The boy then fled downstairs to seek help, returning soon afterward with the hotel's assistant manager, and after a near-breathless Roland began to beg him for help, he rushed to summon medical aid. Dr. Harold Flanders of Kansas City General Hospital arrived soon after Roland was discovered and was one of the first to witness the extent of his injuries. Ronald had his neck, wrists, and ankles all bound with cord. His neck had visible bruising and suggested someone had attempted to strangle him. He also had multiple stab wounds to his chest, with one wound dangerously close to his heart, while another had punctured his lung. Repeated blows to the right side of his head had rendered him with a serious skull fracture, and he had been struck so hard that there was blood spray on the ceiling of his hotel room. Dr. Flanders cut the cords from Roland's wrist and asked him who had done this to him, only to have Roland reply with one single word: "Nobody." Roland then claimed that he'd sustained his injuries after falling and hitting his head on the edge of the room's bathtub, and denied trying to take his own life when the subject was raised. Shortly afterwards, Roland lost consciousness and was completely comatose by the time he arrived at Kansas City General. Hospital staff fought hard to save his life, but sadly, Roland passed away shortly after midnight on January 5th of 1935. The coroner, who performed an autopsy on Roland, determined that he had died as a result of his wounds. His estimated time of death was logged as having occurred between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, and aside from the tag on the necktie, which indicated it had been manufactured in New Jersey, there were no clues to Roland's identity or background. No knives were found at the scene of the crime, which led to the dismissal of him taking his own life as a cause of Roland's death, since the stab wounds in his chest could not be accounted for. The cords used to tie him suggested the involvement of others, and detectives found other items that were checked in as evidence, including a hairpin, a safety pin, an unsmoked cigarette, and a full bottle of diluted sulfuric acid. 4 fingerprints, small enough that detectives believed they had been a woman's, were found on the room's phone. These fingerprints could not be matched to Roland or to any of the hotel employees who had been known to have entered the room. It seemed obvious that someone had entered Roland's hotel room at some point during the early hours of the morning, but frustratingly, not a single member of hotel staff recalled seeing anyone during that period of the morning. With no fingerprint match and no witnesses, law enforcement was forced to seek help through the local media. But not only did the coverage not generate any credible leads, but no next of kin came forward to claim Roland's body. This is about the time police began to suspect that their murder victim wasn't actually named Roland T. Owen. His body was stored in a local funeral parlor for almost 2 months, and he only avoided an unceremonious, anonymous burial due to a mysterious donor financing his funeral at the last moment. This donor paid by wire transfer and had a floral arrangement delivered which bore a note saying, "Luis." For almost 18 months afterwards, the man's identity remained a complete enigma, until finally, an Alabama woman named Ruby Ogletree spotted a photo of a man in a newspaper, one who had a very distinctive scar above his right ear. Ruby came forward to identify the dead man as her son, Artemis Ogletree, who had been born in Florida back in 1915. He was one of 3 children, and during his childhood, an accident with some hot grease left a sizable scar on his head above his ear, which remained hairless afterward. According to his mother, Artemis was just 19 when he left Birmingham, Alabama to hitchhike to California. Years later, she received a number of letters from him, some from as far away as Egypt. Some of these letters requested money from her, and each time she obliged him. Then in August of 1935, Ruby claimed to have received a call from someone in Memphis, Tennessee. The man calling told her that Artemis had saved his life in a fight and that Artemis himself could not call because he was now happily settled in Cairo. The caller added that Artemis was unable to write to her because he had lost one of his thumbs in the same fight which had saved the caller's life. Ruby noted that the man spoke wildly and incoherently for over 30 minutes, and that according to the timeline of her son's death, all the letters had been sent post-mortem. It also emerged that Artemis had never been to Egypt, as records kept by shipping companies found no records that Artemis had ever visited the place. These same letters were connected to a murder which occurred in New York during 1937, but the investigation into the suspect quickly fell apart. However, one of the accused aliases was Donald Kelso, perhaps even the same Don that was being referred to in Artemis's note. Donald Kelso, whose real name was Joseph Martin, had been arrested for murder after he killed a man he shared a room with before shipping the body to Memphis in a trunk. According to a story about the case in the New Yorker, Kansas City police had matched samples of his handwriting to that in the letters written by Ruby Ogletree. However, no charges were filed against Martin in relation to Artemis's murder, and the KCPD kept the case open. The case files show that different detectives reviewed the murder every few years throughout the 1950s, but gradually, the case went cold. The absence of suspects in the case has inspired several different theories on who killed Artemis and why. There were telephone calls alleging that Roland was killed in retaliation for a broken engagement, and that he was having an affair with a woman who'd rather see him dead than in the arms of his wife. However, organized crime has also been considered, since Artemis seems somehow connected to Joseph Martin, the career criminal from New York City. Little was known about Martin or the shadowy criminal organization he represented, but some theories assign them as a great deal of power. Some theorize that the reason Artemis's killer remained invisible to the hotel staff was because his killer was a member of the hotel staff, and that whatever bloodthirsty group wanted Artemis dead were able to manipulate, intimidate, or pay off one of the staff members into murdering him. That explains why the killer was apparently able to lock Artemis's door from the outside, and why no one had seen any guests or outsiders moving around the hallways at the time of his murder. Sadly, this angle was completely neglected by law enforcement at the time, and not a single member of the hotel's staff was questioned aggressively in the aftermath. Perhaps if they had been, Artemis Ogletree's life and death wouldn't still be such a mystery, and perhaps his killer might have actually been brought to justice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and super fun live streams on Sunday, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to call your grandma.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Chime a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, have you ever been frustrated by hidden fees with your checking accounts? Have you ever been surprised to find foreign transaction fees, monthly service fees, and transfer fees being charged to your account? Well, with Chime, you can avoid all of these things. Chime is an award-winning app and debit card that has no overdraft, foreign transaction, monthly service, and transfer fees. They have over 60,000 fee-free in-network ATMs at locations like Walgreens, 7-Elevens, CVS, and more. And that's more than the top 3 national banks combined. You can also send money to anyone, even if they aren't on Chime. No fees for you or cash-out fees for them. And in the spirit of complete transparency, it is important to know that banking services provided by and debit cards issued by the Bancorp Bank or Stride Bank, NA, members FDIC, out-of-network ATM withdrawal fees apply, except at MoneyPass ATM in a 7-Eleven location, and at any Allpoint or Visa Plus Alliance ATM. Other fees such as third-party and cash deposit fees may apply too. But apart from this, you should be in the clear. It's time to say goodbye to hidden fees. Join the millions of Americans already loving Chime. Sign up takes only 2 minutes and doesn't affect your credit score. Get started today at chime.com/be scared. That's chime.com/be scared. Often, I enjoy walking my dog at night time. This is mainly due to the fact that my dog is harder to walk when people are around with their own dogs. So, we tend to walk around parks in the area when they've become somewhat secluded, I guess. I'm also not a very big guy. I'm about 5'10" and pretty lanky, so I wouldn't call myself an intimidating figure. However, my 120-pound black boxer lab named Loki could be somewhat considered threatening to most from what I hear. I figured that his size would be used as a deterrent for anyone looking to cause nightly troubles. But man, I was dead wrong. You see, on one specific night in the fall of 2016, I can recall an encounter that reminds me of why I'm so reluctant to walk around once daylight falls. This specific park is one that I've been to a couple of times, and from what I remember, this park is usually secluded around 6:30 and later. Aside from a couple of joggers or very few other dog walkers, not many people walk the same path that I take. I also like to put on my headphones and just listen to music while I'm walking. But on this specific night, I chose not to wear them since my phone was on low battery and I wanted to preserve it as long as I could. Anyway, the walk was going pretty much as usual, I would say. Loki did his business and we continued on our usual path. About midway on our walk, I realized that it had started to get really dark. But since he was done with his business too, I decided to cut the walk somewhat short and we took a shortcut that kind of led us off the path. The path had a bunch of trees surrounding the area and there were still leaves on the branches. With that being said, I felt a weird feeling as if I was being watched. I have pretty bad anxiety sometimes, but since I knew the town was safe, I knew that nothing was going to really happen. But still, I could not for the life of me shake off the feeling of being watched. I peered back to see if anyone had been following me out of anxiety, and every single time, nobody was there. In fact, nobody was anywhere. This whole shortcut was essentially secluded. But suddenly, Loki stopped walking and also looked back. I told him, "Loki, come on boy, we gotta go, man." One thing I failed to mention was that Loki is a big coward. I noticed his tail was tucked between his legs, which is a telltale sign that a dog is afraid. I'll admit too that I was a little curious and still a bit nervous, but I didn't want to find out what he had heard or noticed, that's for sure. I just wanted to get out ASAP. I pulled a little and he began to walk, but every now and then I would see him peer back. After maybe a minute or so of walking, he stopped again and this time he began to growl. Now, despite being a coward, Loki is a bark but no bite kind of dog. So I took this chance to see exactly what he was growling at. It was quite dark, so I couldn't really see well, so I used my phone's flashlight to see what was up. Trees. Just trees. Which means that what he heard was probably just some kind of an animal, right? Once again, I turned around and I kept walking. He continued to peer back once in a while still, but this time I noticed that it was a lot more frequent. I just said to myself, must just be squirrels or maybe a bird, and I ignored it. But then, I heard what happened to be actual footsteps and branches breaking, and there is absolutely no way a small animal could have produced a sound like that. Loki turned around quick and, still with his tail tucked, he began to growl and bark at a figure that I could only describe as a man in his early 50s, possibly late 40s, appear from out of the woods. He was dressed in dirty clothing, his hair was long and was graying. He had one hand in his pocket and he said to me, "Nice dog you have here, kid. What breed is he?" He's a boxer lab," I replied. "Oh, I love dogs. Mind if I pet him?" He wandered over. The man got closer and emerged from the trees, and as he got closer, I realized that he was quite tall and pretty burly too. Loki instantly got bad vibes, and he ran behind me and started to bark at him. "Actually, I do kind of mind, man. My dog here doesn't really like strangers. Sorry, but it's probably not the best to pet him," I quickly stated. "Oh, it's okay, man. Really, he seems like a really friendly guy. Just a little pet wouldn't harm him, right?" the man retorted as he got closer. I felt extremely uncomfortable as he appeared to get closer and closer with every step. I don't know why this guy just couldn't take no for an answer. I mean, I usually don't allow people to even pet Loki unless he comes up to them first. If he's scared of you, then I usually do not want him to freak out by letting him be pet by a stranger. This is especially the case when said stranger came from the woods behind trees. "I'm really sorry, man. I'm scared that he'd bite you or something," I told him as I began to walk away. Like I said before, I wasn't trying to be judgmental or anything, but the dude literally came out from the woods and was possibly the one trailing us from before. "I don't know why you won't just let me introduce myself to him, man," the guy replied, angrily. This time, I began to speed walk. I was very uncomfortable and my fight or flight instincts began to take over. He followed us too and also kept muttering curses to himself. I don't know if this man was like under the influence or something, but he just did not let up. I won't lie too, I started to get a little bit angry myself. I mean, why can't a guy just take no for an answer? He began to match my speed, almost as if he was trying to catch up to us as well. Loki and I both took this as an answer to start sprinting as fast as we could. To be honest too, I really don't remember much of the running. It was all a bit of a blur to me, but I do remember the spine-tingling feeling of hearing his footsteps rapidly increasing behind me. For a man of his stature, he was quite fast as well. I also realized pretty quickly that his intentions may not have just been to pet my dog. No one reasonable would go that far just to pet a dog that clearly wanted nothing to do with them, right? I looked behind me and he was now in pursuit. Maybe about 10 feet behind me he was chasing us. I'll never forget the look in his eyes too. I've never had anyone look at me like that. A look of killer intent. And all for what? Just because he couldn't pet my dog? My instincts told me that he definitely had sinister intent behind that. But finally, the path led back to the park exit and into the busier streets. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park. I made sure nobody was following me, and I even made sure to walk on the populated streets this night. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally got home, but I knew for a fact that I was not going to get a minute of sleep that night. From my window in the porch, I watched pretty much all night with Loki, just to see if anyone had followed us home. I also made a police report with my parents. After all, this guy seemed to have been quite suspicious, and who knows what his true intentions were. Had his target been someone who couldn't protect themselves or run away like I did, what would he have done? I also often ask myself, what if I had worn my headphones that night and the sound of music drowned the footsteps behind me? Ever since, I haven't walked Loki in that park, and I've also made it a habit of mine to walk on livelier streets at night. If I could give anyone one piece of advice, even if you live in a relatively safe town, never, ever let your guard down. You just never know what kind of person might be lurking in the shadows, or, as in my case, within the trees. You know, I think I sort of forgot about this whole thing until recently, but this took place over 10 years ago when I was 15 or 16. I was just a bored teen in a somewhat small town and wanted to get off the computer for a bit, I think. It was late at night, around midnight, maybe 11, when someone like me really should have stayed in, but I felt like just going on a long walk, which I never did, but hey, what's going to happen to me here? It was a chill place. Once you get past the school in the neighborhood, or to one end of the neighborhood, there's a long road with some nice homes on it that heads towards the grocery store, and a bigger road with 4 lanes. This long road has a sidewalk, barely any lights, and goes past a big open area with a horse farm, and one small waste facility across from the road from the horse field. The facility is up a slight incline, and between it and the road is a dip in the ground for the rainwater to accumulate and run beneath the driveway, meaning if you drove off the road, you'd basically be going down a small half-pipe right there. So, I walked past the school, past this horse field, and all the way down the long road to the 4-lane road and kept walking. It's now around 1 AM, I would guess, and the roads are empty, but they're totally illuminated by streetlights, so I felt fine. At some point, though, this little car speeds down the road way too close to the sidewalk, and I saw their brake lights come on as they kept driving pretty quickly. And something about the car and how close they drove to the sidewalk just gave me this major feeling of fear and that I needed to just go home. It wasn't a, hey, they came too close to me fear, but it was like a full body feeling that I just had to go. I didn't think this way at the time, but looking back, I feel like it was someone thinking, hey, they look young, should I go back? And holding their foot lightly on the brake pedal just enough to slow down gradually and turn the lights on. So I walked back for a good 30 to 45 minutes, and I was now coming back up to the horse field on this dark road, which meant that I just needed to make it past this wide open area before I was at the school, which basically meant that I was home. This whole time, I kept looking back and watching for cars or someone, but now I was feeling safe because it had been so long and I was on this super dark road. But right before the horse field, there was this big front yard of some country house that's down a dirt road. The front yard had a fence, but it was just posts with like 3 planks going across it, which meant that a person could easily slide between the planks if they just angled themselves right. And I'm getting to the end of that yard when a car speeds by me, and I swear that it's exactly the same shape as the car that passed me before, and I got that same feeling of fear. It was too dark to see the color, but the shape was unmistakable. I see the brake lights light up, and this time they slowed down drastically before whipping the car to the side of the road to go down into the dip at the waste facility, drive up the incline to circle around and drive back out to the road like a madman in the span of probably 3 or 4 seconds. I just want to be clear too that no one in their right mind would have used that dip to turn around even slowly, and whipping the car around that way is abnormal anyways. I swear too that I was stressing so hard and was nearly frozen just watching them do that because I knew that it was the same car and something bad was definitely going to happen to me. Right at the corner of the front yard though, by the field, there was a big oak tree growing a bit more than like one teenage boy's width away from the fence for the yard, and that was perfect. The bottom plank for the fence was just barely above the ground, maybe a few inches up the post is all, so it was just enough to hide me if I laid down against it. The moment that I saw car headlights start to turn around to drive the other way, my first instinct was to just dive into that spot between the tree and the plank. I fit perfectly too, and managed to get in place before they turned left back onto the road. I put my hood over the back of my head and I just laid there. I heard their brakes though sliding against the wheel as they drove past that yard, and then heard them speed up and drive away a second later. I didn't look. I kept my head down and breathed as heavily as possible while I could, so I didn't have a full-on panic attack until I was sure that they were gone. I got up, looked back, and made sure that I saw no silhouettes of cars and no lights, and I just booked it up the road and to the school. You can bet too that your homie here never went out that late alone again. That was a lesson learned the hard way. All I can say is trust your gut and try to always have a way to protect yourself, if need be. So this story happened back in the 90s to my parents during their senior year of high school. Since their group of friends already had cars, the favourite thing that they loved to do was night hiking around the state's local mental hospital, mainly to its old dairy farm. But this was located on the side of a mountain surrounded by agricultural fields and an open grassland as well. Since the dairy farm was not close to the mental hospital and the nearest city life was located about 5 miles away, at night the area was extremely dark and quiet. Before the dairy farm was closed down, the patients from the mental hospital would go there for work. During this time, some patients lost their lives at this location due to accidents. By the 90s, it was abandoned and left like a ghost town of its own, especially due to its rumors of it being haunted. And it made the perfect place for a fearful experience. So this particular night, around 2 in the morning, my dad, my mum, 4 of their female friends, and 1 male friend planned to go to the dairy farm. They took 2 cars, and when they got to the usual parking spot on the side of the mountain, they saw that there was already a group of like 20 people standing around their cars. When my parents and their friends got out of their cars, they noticed that the group of the men all had shaved heads, were Caucasian, and in their mid-20s. As my parents walked past them, both groups ignored each other and avoided making eye contact. However, my mum turned her head to see one of the men, and as she did this, the man pulled his jacket back and showed a pistol tucked into his pants. Then he pulled his lower lip down, which revealed that he had a triple K tattooed on his bottom lip. When they were out of hearing range, my mum whispered to my dad, "That man has a gun and he has that tattoo." My dad brushed it off, thinking my mum was over-exaggerating things, and said that it was too dark to even notice those 2 things. So with that, my parents and their friends walked through the grassland to get to the dairy farm. The hike to get there is about maybe half a mile from where they parked. However, as soon as they got to the farm, they heard gunshots coming from the direction of the cars. Fearing that something happened to their cars, they booked it back to the parking lot. When they got back, the group of men, they were already gone. But as they inspected their cars, they saw that all of their tires were slashed and their windows were broken and smashed. But my dad, who used a particular coloured blanket as a seat cover, and his stereo too, were both stolen. And now they just stood there by their cars wondering what to do next. I mean, it's not like they could just call someone for help. Nobody had a cell phone back then. And since they were deep in this secluded area, they couldn't flag someone down for a pickup. The nearest gas station with a payphone was like 5 miles away as well. Both my dad and his male friend, they didn't want to leave the cars alone since they both drove classic cars and they feared that the men would come back. And eventually it was decided amongst them that sending both males to run to the payphone was the best option, leaving the women by themselves with the cars. This was because they feared that the shaved head men were waiting down the road expecting them to walk to the payphone. My dad and his friend, they ran to the gas station, and as they left, my mum and her friends all gathered heavy rocks to use as some sort of protective weapon and hid away in the bushes behind the trees. 2 hours had passed when my mum noticed headlights coming down the road. 2 tow trucks rolled into the parking spot. At this, too, an immense fear spread throughout the group, until they say that out of the 2 trucks came my dad, his brothers, and the friend. They hooked up the cars to the tow trucks and were out of there in a matter of minutes. My dad told my mum that as they were running down the dark and empty road, they kept their eyes open just in case the men were hiding with their cars, lights off or something, but luckily they got to the gas station without a problem. Now, this next part, it may be hard to believe, but it is 100% the truth. 2 weeks passed and my dad managed to get his car fully repaired and drivable again. My mum and dad were driving to the local store when they parked and got out of the car. As they were walking into the store, a man was walking towards them. As he got closer, my mum realized that This was the same shaved-headed man who flashed the gun at her. My mum immediately told this to my dad, but just like the first time, my dad denied that this was true. Then, 2 weeks later at the same store, my mum and dad were sitting in their car while my mum saw a car pull up next to them. As the man got out and just sort of stood there by his car, she quickly noticed that it was the same man from before. My mum immediately told this to my dad, but again, my dad denied it, but my mum looked into his car and saw the very recognizable colourful blanket that my dad used as a seat cover. This was when my dad finally connected the dots and got out of the car to confront the guy. But the man, realizing what was happening, jumped back into his car and drove away. They didn't have time to get the license plate, unfortunately, and so nothing ever really came of it. The next week, when my dad was filling gas into his car, a car pulled up right behind him, and lo and behold, it was the same man. My dad immediately got into the guy's face, ready to confront him, but the man's friends got out of the car and one of them pulled out a gun. The man with the gun then told everyone to get inside the car, and the group just drove away. It's been almost 30 years, and they've never seen those men ever since, but to this day, my parents still wonder if all of those encounters were a coincidence or something a lot more sinister. This was one of the first times I ever was truly scared by something paranormal. I was 14 at the time. As of sharing this, I'm 25 years old. And my father and I had just started buying guns as I took an interest in shooting. We got an M44, made in 1953 in Poland. For those who don't know much about old guns too, a Mosin Nagant is the battle rifle of Russia from pre-World War I to the end of World War II. And the M44 designation is for a shortened rifle version with a bayonet that can be folded out. So, we had the rifle for a while. I had even shot it and everything before the event occurred. I had researched the marks of the rifle, which is why I knew where it was made and all the little details of the gun. Me being a curious history lover, I love learning anything that I can about items I have. It was months since getting it as well. The initial thrill of getting a gun had long since worn off, and so, really, other than hoping to go shooting sometime soon, it was not on my mind when I went to bed. The reason I mention this too is that it's not assumed that I am just overly imaginative, and after getting an old military gun, I just imagined all of this. Anyway, the rifle was at this point the only real gun that we had besides our few .22 caliber rifles for plinking, and they were stored in my closet. So like I said, I went to bed. It was during a break, so no school, which was great because of what unfolded. I didn't sleep much. But I was asleep when I woke up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. for just no reason. I looked at my closet near my bed, and the door was open, which it was never because it didn't open normally, though I never really shut the door too. But when looking in the closet, it was like I could see something. I got up and I walked literally into the closet that was not my closet. I can only describe it as if I was transported by the closet to a different place, which was also nighttime, and I could sort of see ahead of me what seems to be a watchtower or something. I apparently too was in a watchtower all of a sudden. A fence was near the watchtowers, and then another further one away from it. I then am alerted to a figure moving near the fence, and I raised my gun, fired a round off, which caused a horrible scream, chambered the next round, and fired again, which ceased the memory. I woke up at this point all of a sudden, not knowing where I was or what was going on. I'm standing in my closet now, truly my closet. But nothing really happened in whatever this was. It almost felt like some sort of a hologram disappeared. Maybe it wasn't a dream, and it revealed me sort of just standing there. The feeling, though, was as if I was pulled back through. It's hard to describe, so bear with me. But with this, I left my closet and sat down in my bed wondering what the heck just happened. But I did end up falling back to sleep, and the next morning I woke up early, 8 AM or so, which is abnormal for me as I'm more of a 10 AM sort of person. Don't judge, I'm just not a morning person unless I must be. But as I woke up, I looked at my closet and I saw a dark figure peeking out of my closet. I didn't scream. I sort of let out a squeak of fear, I guess. To be honest, too, I wasn't even thinking of last night. I just felt like there was someone that broke into my house and was looking at me, even though there really was no reason that he would be a dark shadow instead of a detailed human being, as my room was very well lit by now. But yet, when I got up to look, there was nothing there. The next night, I woke up at 2 AM to find a dark shadow once more looking at me from my closet. I will overstate the obvious too. It was pitch black night, and I'm seeing a shadow figure. Yes, this sounds absolutely absurd, I know, because black on black doesn't really show itself, right? I'm a long-time drama club kid, and I know this, which is why this freaks me out still. Yet, I could see it. A dark figure as clear as the one that I saw before. I immediately bolted for my parents' room, screaming my lungs out though as I ran. I explained in a sheer panic how there was a person in my closet and that someone was in the house. But once we were back in my room, there was nothing. This repeated the following night too. The only difference is that the figure was outside of the closet now, and the same effect. I ran screaming. The following night, the same thing too, but now it's looking down at me from next to my bed, and again I'm fleeing. By this point, something connected for me though, and I also demanded the rifle be removed from my closet, and it was placed in my parents' bedroom. And with this, it ceased, all of it. Since then, I refuse to ever have the gun in my bedroom when I sleep, and it remains locked away in a gun safe that we now have. Now, I'm a pretty skeptical person, more so today than I was then. With that said though, I am very much aware of sleep paralysis and all of those things, but to me, those explanations just make no sense here, as none of the times I was unable to move or anything. I mean, I was able to get up and move to the closet and get up and flee screaming like a madman. An atheist, a non-believing friend, I told, actually referenced some gulag pictures which matched my dream, or whatever that was, extremely close, which freaked me out as I'd never even really heard of a gulag yet when I had the experience, and I'd never really researched them before. More so too is the fact that gulags shouldn't explain it, as they were not a Polish thing but a Stalinist thing which ended up with his death in 1953. Everything in my mind wants to explain this away, but yet nothing explains why this happened. I don't really disbelieve in the paranormal. Even as a skeptic, I do believe stuff can happen, and I can only sort of reach the conclusion that I saw something that once happened, but to who, why, and where? I guess I may never know. I would actually love for some of you guys to try and debunk this too, simply because, honestly, I would love to believe that it wasn't real and that I could just explain it away, because the thought that someone is attached to this gun truly is pretty tragic. When I was in my early 20s, I went through a really dark time. All of my friends had moved away, and I'd gone through a traumatic breakup. I was also stuck in a town that I didn't like. I was in school and couldn't leave, and I was living with my sister in an old shanty house. I was super depressed, and I think the energy that I was putting out alienated me from my peers. I've always been sensitive and interested in the occult. I started reading books on chaos magic and Grant Morrison's pop magic. I began making up rituals and got really into spiritualism, and I used candle magic, would write messages on the candles, and would use my blood sometimes. I always protected myself and had rosemary and different crystals on hand. But I started having really vivid dreams of, and I know this sounds weird, but bear with me, a wolf spirit named Jenny. We would sit atop mountains in my dreams and drink tea and talk, and I asked her what she was, but she would never answer my questions. I dreamt about her almost every night, in fact, and it got to the point where I even saw her shadow once or twice in my waking state, I think. Anyway, one night I did a pretty powerful ritual, I guess you could say. But while I thought that I was coming from a good and positive place, I had a lot of sadness in my heart. That night, when I was trying to sleep, I just had the worst feeling too. I felt like a million eyes were watching me and my stomach was in knots. I was so scared that I turned the light on and tried to go back to bed. But 5 minutes later, the light bulb in my room literally burst. I was in the dark again and I saw something. It was white and translucent and sort of looked like it was made of fine lace. Whatever it was, it flew from one side of my room to the other, and I was so scared at this point that I decided to crawl into my sister's bed. She was sound asleep, and I slept at the foot of her bed. 5 a.m. comes along, and my sister wakes me up. She's really startled for some reason, and she tells me that she dreamt of a wolf that was telling her to get up and walk outside. This wolf kept insisting that she get out of her bed and leave the house. She ended up waking up standing at her car, keys in hand. She had apparently sleptwalked, something she had never done before, and she had no idea that I'd been sleeping at the foot of her bed, and was startled when she walked back into her room and saw me. Mind you, I had never told her about Jenny, so it's crazy that she dreamt of a creature that looked so similar and was trying to coax her away from me. After that happened, I stopped playing with magic, and after a while the dreams of Jenny stopped too. But I still wonder about all of this. I still wonder about what she was. If any of you have had any similar things happen or could give me some insight, I would really appreciate it. I've read a lot about all of this stuff, but who knows? Maybe I'm missing something. So I, a 22-year-old female, live in a brand new apartment complex on a nice side of town. My city is pretty safe in general. This is the first time that I've lived alone, so even though it is a safe area, I took some precautions, which included installing a Ring video doorbell. I have honestly never needed it in the 6 months that I've lived here, so no unexpected visitor has ever come by. That is, until last night. I was sitting at home alone with my dog, working on some homework. It was nearly 8 p.m. and starting to get dark. At night, I have my Ring set up to alert me when any person is detected outside of my door. And I received a notification of motion at my door, but I didn't think much of it. At 8 p.m, people are still walking down the hall and up the stairs, etc. About 30 seconds later, though, I received several loud knocks on my door, and my Ring is pushed rapidly 3 times. At this point, I was a little bit spooked, and my dog is going nuts as well. I open up the app to see 2 men standing outside of my door. I sort of debated internally on if I should open it or not, but then decided since it wasn't quite dark yet, and my neighbors were home, that it would be safe to do so. I sort of slowly open the door, just enough to put my head out. The man nearest to me says that they are with the Wealth Committee and complimented my wreath. He then went on to say that he was with an internet company and he and his partner were here to offer me a deal. Now, my apartment has a very strict no-tolerance policy for solicitation of any kind. We are told to immediately report that kind of activity, and there are signs posted all around stating that solicitation is prohibited by law here. I told the men that I'm happy with my current service and was not interested in switching. The man who spoke first continued to speak about the great deal that they were offering. I continued to decline, and he kept saying that he lived really close to here and he'd be happy to personally set up the service. He even offered to come inside and help me get started immediately. Obviously, I declined his offer once more, and he reiterated that if I changed my mind to give him a call, because he could be here in 5 minutes to help me out. He handed me a business card, and I tried to end the conversation again, but he then tells me that he just can't walk away knowing that I could get such a good deal, and I'm saying no to it. At that point, my instincts were telling me something was off. I decided to take a more aggressive approach, I guess you could say, and I asked him if he was aware that my apartment has a strict no solicitation policy. He said that he was aware, but that he cleared it with management. My apartment actually has a very small management team, and I know every single one of them. So I asked who he had cleared it with, and he said that he cleared it with the guys on the golf cart, Mike and Will, and that Mike was a great guy. And now I knew that it was all a lie. Our management team is only women here. There is nobody by the name of Mike or Will. In fact, only one man works here, and his name is Joe. I say, "Thanks, but I'm not interested." Man closed the door and locked it loudly. I took a closer look at the business card that he handed me, and it had a logo and the name that he gave me, but the email was not a company email. It was a Yahoo account. The phone number also did not appear when I searched it up for the company. I decided to post about my encounter in the residents-only Facebook page, and a few other women commented that they had had similar interactions tonight, but that they were given different names, and the strange thing was, none of the men of the couples were approached. It was only women that they spoke with. They talked to my upstairs neighbor, I think, and my neighbors across the hall, both girls, and didn't speak to either of the men that live on the same floor as me. Everyone was also given different names, and everyone was offered vastly different deals. 2 women were told that they didn't have business cards to hand out. I thought that it might be worth Googling this guy's name to see if anything popped up as well. And sure enough, the second result was a report on an offender registry. Turns out, the man who spoke at my door has 5 felonies and has served several years in jail for various charges, including trafficking a controlled substance, theft by deception, and possession of stolen property. I knew that it was him too because there was a photo attached to the report. He's currently on parole until November apparently, but I'm not sure if I'm overthinking this situation because this is my first time experiencing something like this, but I know it didn't feel right, that's for sure. Maybe I'm just being dramatic or paranoid, but the entire thing feels more than a little bit off. I'm not sure if they were just scammers or if they were staking out places to rob, or maybe worse, who knows, but I reported it to my property manager who was investigating it today. I'm just a bit uneasy about the whole thing, I guess. If they return, I'll be calling the police for sure. As of the time of sharing this, nothing else suspicious has happened, thankfully, and I'm safe at the moment, but I'll continue to stay vigilant. Be safe out there, guys. So I'm a bit of a skeptic of the supernatural, and I've never put much stock into ghosts or spirits. I do think aliens are real and rationally could exist through biological processes. My kids have had, well, experiences in each house that we've lived in, though. I always wrote it off as overactive imagination, but for a little over a year now, my youngest son has been talking to us about the baby in his room. He's only 2 and will be 3 soon. So, it started when he first started talking. He would wake up screaming for us, saying that the baby in his room was trying to get him. He would be terrified and would take a long time to get him calmed and back to sleep. My wife and I, we just sort of wrote this off as being overstimulated by something that he saw on TV. He seemed to calm down, only mentioning his friend every so often, but he stopped waking up terrified, so we thought that we were past it. Here lately, though, as he's gotten more articulate, He's bringing up details out of nowhere that we're having a hard time explaining. Things like the description of this thing, its favorite things, and where it comes from and how it comes in the room. Some of these details, we cannot figure out how he would get this info. Like, the baby is naked, smaller than him, and it can fly with wings. Its favorite food is dates and likes to drink milk. We're a middle-class white family, and the only time that I've ever heard of dates was in Indiana Jones, which he's never seen. He says it flies into his room from the windows and talks to him. He refuses to elaborate on what it wants and what they talk about. He says that it lives in the woods and it is never present during the day, like when he's playing with his toys. Which, if it was an imaginary friend, I would have thought that he'd be playing with it when he was playing. I'm coming here because I'm starting to see things that I can't explain and hear things that just do not make sense as well. Like, last week, I was out doing yard work and had been playing with a clothes hanger, like a grappling hook sort of thing. And when I came back inside through the front door, I found the hanger standing up by itself about 2 feet away from the door. He was upstairs playing and nobody was around it, and I thought that it was strange and asked my wife how the heck he did that, picked it up and put it away. The next day, as I was walking from my kitchen to the bedroom, I saw motion out of my peripheral. It was moving fast, and when I turned my head, I saw a shadow figure flying near the ceiling, going from the bar into the kitchen, past a hanging light fixture, and through the wall just above the glass door leading to the deck. And the best way that I can describe it is, it was a lot like a fairy. It was about 8 inches tall with butterfly-like wings. The top wings were sort of lobed, but the bottom wings were kind of pointed. At this point, I turned around to my wife to ask if she just saw that. She had her back to it though, so unfortunately she didn't see anything. After this incident, I reconsidered the clothes hanger. I tried for nearly an hour to make this thing stand up. I was hoping that it was curved or bent in a way to make it stand up, or there was a spot in the hardwood floor that was perfect for it to nestle in or something, but I just could not replicate it no matter how hard I tried. I asked my son what he did, or if he even did it, and he said that he sang to it, and his friend made it stand up. The only thing that I know about fairies is from movies, and I believe in things that could possibly exist, like aliens or Bigfoot, I suppose. I don't think spirits are real, but all of this is definitely making me reevaluate things a bit, and everything that I've researched about these things from folklore is definitely not pleasant. Anyway, I guess I'm here to try and get some answers, and I'm wondering if any of you guys have seen anything similar or have had any experience with this type of thing. If you have or do know anything, then please do drop a message below, because I'm a bit freaked out. So, I'm a server at a local restaurant in Texas, and today I had a table that struck me as just really odd. It was a man who appeared to be in his early 30s and a girl who looked maybe around 8 or 9. I understand that different families have different dynamics, but almost everyone, including married couples, wants separate dishes when sharing a salad. However, this grown man and child ate out of the same really small bowl, huddled close together, which I found strange. The girl wouldn't really look at me, and the man did all the talking, which is not particularly out of the ordinary, but she was huddled down and hiding her face. Kids can be shy though, but most of them at least sit up straight. I sort of mentioned it to the bartender that I found the man creepy, and he basically told me to write it off or ignore it, so I did. I pretty much ignored the bad feeling in my gut, the feeling that everyone says to listen to, right? After the two of them left, I walked over to their table to look at the receipt and see how much they tipped me. However, my attention was immediately caught by writing at the bottom. Along the bottom left portion of the receipt was written, "I think you're very pretty, miss," with a smiley face next to it, Then along the bottom it said, "Not my dad." All of the writing appeared to be in a different sort of handwriting than whoever wrote the tip. I found this really weird, and I showed it to the management and they said to ignore it. My boss said that the girl may have written the note to say that I was pretty and then added on the last part to specify her dad, the man that I assumed was her dad, didn't think that. But I don't know. I have no idea, and it's not really my business, I suppose, but this entire interaction and the receipt gave me such a bad feeling, and I'm still kind of creeped out by it. I mean, it's entirely possible that the letter is just harmless. But then again, the "not my dad" part may be specifying that this little girl is in trouble. I'm not sure if I should report it or not, or even be concerned, but I figured that I would share it here and see what you guys think. A few nights ago, I had a wedding to attend, and whenever I have to dress fancy, I put on this sparkly necklace that my grandma left to me when she passed away. The chain is very thin gold, and the pendant is a thick solid gold R, which is my grandma's and my first initial. The front of the R is covered in diamonds, and it's the kind of necklace pendant that doesn't twist or rotate. It stays facing whichever way you put it, so naturally, every time that I put this necklace on, I always check to make sure that I put it on the right way, the shiny side facing out. So, before the wedding, I put on the necklace as per usual, looked in the mirror to make sure that it was on the right way, which it was, and then I go to the wedding and take a bunch of pictures with friends. All the while, in every single picture, my necklace is faced the right way. Then, I get home and I'm exhausted and I go lay in bed. I'm too tired to take off my jewelry and makeup, so I just leave the necklace on, which I never do because the chain is fragile. Right before I went to sleep, though, my cat jumped onto the bed with me and was laying across my chest, being adorable, so I took a picture of her laying on my chest. In that picture, with my cat, taken moments before I went to sleep, the necklace was on the right way, sparkly diamond side facing out. Anyway, I had a horrible dream that night where someone was pulling on my necklace and I was yelling at them to stop, but it was too late and the necklace broke off my neck. Instead of the person taking it and stealing it, the moment that it broke off and fell to the floor, the person who broke it just disappeared or evaporated. I then picked it off the ground and was examining it close to my face and realized that the clasp was broken, and I was all upset about it. The next morning, I jolted awake from the dream and went to take a shower. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw something that made my stomach drop to the floor. My necklace? It was now on backwards. The diamond side was facing inwards, which, let me just say, is impossible unless it was taken off me and turned completely around and put back on. I definitely did not take it off myself in my sleep too, because I actually have arthritis in my hand, so it's really hard for me to unclasp it, even while I'm awake, because it's so small. I asked my husband if he had taken it off me in my sleep, and he said no, and that he was working on his computer the entire time that I was asleep and didn't even come into the room once. I have just zero explanation for how this could have possibly happened. I've racked my brain for literally any reasonable answer, and I can't think of even one. Whatever happened, it gives me shivers to even think about it. So this happened in my very first relationship. I was almost 21 at the time when I met my ex. I'd never been kissed, never had even been on a date, but somehow I got myself into a relationship with this guy that had helped me with studying for one of my tests a few years ago. Looking back, the relationship itself was also full of major red flags. I don't want to go into detail, obviously, because that's not the point of this story. But essentially, he sometimes told me, "I wish that I could rape you." Bear in mind that he first told me that a few days after I had my first time with him. He also always laughed and smiled creepily when women in movies were beaten up, murdered, or raped. He also always laughed and smiled creepily when women in movies were beaten up, murdered, or raped. When he saw such scenes, he always smiled creepily and told me, "This is a nice scene," etc. He told me too that he liked the look of beaten up women. And to be honest, I just had the biggest pink-coloured glasses on and thought that things were just jokes. Anyway, one evening when I met him, he asked if we could meet a friend of his. I told him, of course, because I had never met any of his friends before. So we drove to his friend's flat, and everything was good. When I was there, they immediately got their shisha, some kind of water-smoking device, no drugs included, and lots of alcohol ready. My ex knew that I never drank, but he begged me to do it, just this one time for him, so I did. It was this kind of extremely sweet sort of strawberry-tasting alcohol in an extremely huge bottle. We sat and talked, smoked the shisha, and we drank, and, well, I drank. Recalling the night, though, my ex and his best friend only had one drink, but once my glass was empty, they immediately put more liquor in it and told me to drink some more. And to be honest, I don't know why, but I did. At the time, I didn't really think about them still being on their first drink, while I had already finished my third or fourth, or even fifth, I think. But I was getting drunk and also feeling extremely unwell. The friend of my ex told me to take off my hoodie, which I did. Thankfully, I had a top underneath. And once I did, he complimented me on my body, and that I shouldn't have come here dressed like that. He touched me by the neck and shoulders and tried to flirt with me, while my ex was right there, mind you, still always giving me more and more liquor. I tried to get away from him, but he got closer again and tried to play with my hair. I was very uncomfortable, but already so drunk at this point that I didn't tell him to get lost. Then my ex and the friend got up and were talking about something in the corner of the room. My ex came back to me, and for about 30 minutes, the friend of my ex was nowhere to be seen. My ex began making out with my drunk self. He tried to undress me, but I denied it, telling him that I was on my period, which was actually true. And once I told him that, I could see that he was upset and almost slightly angry, in fact. He got up and got his friend, talking to him again, but this time I could see that the two were looking kind of frustrated. I know that almost immediately after that, my ex and I went to my ex's flat, because we were told to go. But after that, I can only really remember the morning. My ex told me jokingly that I had passed out right before the bed. I had the worst headache that I had ever experienced in my life, though, and I had my ex go and give me a bucket because my stomach turned and I had to puke so badly. I called my mum to pick me up, and while waiting, my ex told me, sitting on the bed, that his friend would want to have sex with me so badly. And again, you know that I have the fantasy of raping you, right? Then my mum picked me up, and when I was home, I shortly passed out in the bathroom, but after that, I recovered, thankfully. My ex mentioned the things about his friend wanting to have sex with me a few times after that too, and asked me right after if he could give him my number. And a few months after our breakup, his friend sent me a message on Facebook saying that he wanted to meet me. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that those two wanted to get me so drunk that I had no more control and then both have sex with me. And the only thing that got into their way, I think, was my period. It was such a creepy evening, though, and all the things that could have happened with my ex after that led me to believe that. I, for example, recall a time when there was news in our country about a very drunk girl being raped by two men, and he always said she was drunk, they did nothing wrong, she wanted it. Disgusting, I know. It's just sad, though, that my rose-colored glasses didn't let me see that when we were still together. I should have run away immediately after he told me first about his fantasies, but on a happy note, I now have a boyfriend that treats me like I'm the most wonderful person on earth, so that's good, I suppose. My siblings and I, we spent most of our time with our father, but every other weekend, we went to see my mum, who lived with her mother. But they moved around a lot too, and eventually moved to a multi-family home, where we got the basement apartment. And if I had to guess, I think I was around 12 at the time. One of the first things I was told about the house by my grandma, though, was that the house had been around since the Revolutionary War. People unfamiliar with New England may not know how commonplace that is, really, especially in the area of Connecticut that I'm from. Plenty of houses around me were built in like the 1600s and the 1700s. Many of them even have plaques on them with the year date. Now, I always felt just terrified in that basement for some reason, but I didn't even think that was really unusual, to be honest. And I don't know why, but I just never asked myself why I felt so scared all the time. But I always felt like I was being watched, or that there was some other presence near me. It's difficult to put into words, but at the time, being a kid, I just treated it as if I were in a movie 24/7. What I mean is that I sort of felt like there were cameras all over me all the time, and that there was an audience monitoring my every move, even when I slept. At the time, again, though, I didn't attribute this to ghosts or paranormal activity, and I really didn't have any explanation for it. But I felt it most in the bathroom, and I would try to spend the least amount of time there as possible, running in and running out, always thinking that somebody was there. I also always had trouble falling asleep there. My brothers and I all slept in the living room, me and one brother on the pull-out couch bed, and one would sleep on the armchair in the corner. My grandma had her own bedroom, and so did my mum. My mum eventually left. She sold her car and phone and went off with some man that she just met, and we honestly lost contact for years. When she left, I took over her bedroom on the nights that we stayed with our grandma, and sleeping in that room was even more terrifying. I always heard scratching in the walls in my mother's old bedroom. They seemed to me to come from inside the middle of the wall between her room and the kitchen. At the time, I figured it must have been mice, though I had never seen or heard of mice being an issue in the apartment. But the bedroom door would also open on its own, even though my family confirmed that they were not opening my door. I also remember before I would go to sleep, I would always close it as properly as I could, pushing it hard, making sure that it sort of clicked, and yet I would always wake up with the door slightly ajar. Again, at the time, my explanation was that my mother had one of those behind-the-door shoe racks with tons of shoes hanging off of it, and I figured that maybe the weight was pulling open the door. Oh, I had never seen it open with my own eyes, and I couldn't get it to open that way myself, which was a bit weird. Finally, though, I went back to sleeping in the living room and never going into my mother's old bedroom again. And one night, I stayed up late reading using the browser on my DS. My brothers were both asleep in the room with me, and my grandma was in her bedroom with the door closed. I turned my DS off at about, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I would guess. I faced away from the kitchen, looking towards my brothers, and I heard a sound that I didn't recognize. Then, after a couple of seconds, I heard it again, and then again, and I realized that the sound was coming from the refrigerator door opening. I sort of froze and strained to listen closer. I heard the fridge door open, then after about 4 or 5 full seconds close, and then open again. This happened over and over for a few minutes too. I was way too terrified to turn around though, so I just continued laying completely still, frozen in terror. Under no circumstances would I ever have turned around to see what was opening this fridge. I eventually just moved my gaze, looking more to the side, where I noticed that I could also see the light emanating into my view every time the fridge door opened, and turning back every time that it closed. Eventually it stopped, and I must have passed out at some point. But in the morning I told my grandma and brothers about what happened, and confirmed that none of them were messing with the fridge. I also tested the door, and it wasn't one that would just pop open, and you really had to yank on it to open it. Anyway, the families upstairs moved in and out, and all the time, just constantly. Nobody ever lived there very long. But eventually even the landlord decided to live somewhere else, and well, we were the only family living in the entire building. And at that, we decided that it was time for us to move on as well. Towards the end though, at some point, I went outside to hula hoop, and I swear that I saw a shadow watching me from one of the upstairs windows. I never went into the backyard ever again after that. I was just too petrified. I also walked around the perimeter of the huge house on my last day there, and noticed on the side that there was a door at the same level as our basement apartment, but I had no idea where it could have led because there was no other space in our apartment that I hadn't seen, and no other doors too. But this door was padlocked, zip-tied, and the handle had rope and bungee cords tying it closed. And I don't know what it was about it, but the sight of it just left me really unnerved, and I ran back into our apartment immediately upon seeing it. Eventually though, when we moved out to another apartment, I must say that I noticed a different feeling almost immediately. I felt safe for the first time and never felt like I was being watched. And that is when I decided that I think I believe in ghosts. So I'm from California, and way back when I was on the college search, I realized that I'd likely go out to the East Coast if I wanted to play field hockey. My mum and I organized a road trip through Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island to hit a bunch of different schools in a short amount of time. One of the schools was Ithaca College. It was a last-minute decision to stop there too, so we didn't have much time to explore the general area afterwards. We had been told by multiple people, though, that the waterfalls in the area were beyond gorgeous and well worth the stop, so my mum and I decided to swing by one before we left for Pennsylvania. We put Ithaca Falls in our rental car GPS, and it brought us to this red curb loop and an old sort of rundown overlook of the falls. This overlook was down a hill and through some trees, so my mum didn't want to leave the car on a red curb. She encouraged me to go down and check it out on my own, and so I did just that. The first time I went down, I was sure to be observant of everything around me. Didn't want any randos in the woods sneaking up on me. I went onto the ledge and took some pics, sat and listened to the water for a while, then turned around to go back up. When I turned, I got this really odd feeling as if someone was watching me or standing with me. I got really uncomfortable too and sort of started looking around. Nothing seemed to be wrong though, so I calmly headed back up the hill. I got in the car, showed my mum the photos, and realized that I didn't take a video. My mum suggested I go back down to get the video. We've got time, she said, so again I did. The second time I go down, I feel a little less happy, I suppose. I was down a slope, so my mum couldn't see me, and I felt more alone and exposed than the time before, and that sinking feeling just kept growing. I go to the edge, take the video with shaking hands. Now I'm feeling like I need to get out of here because there's an intense sense of urgency. I turn around to go back up, and some sort of force stops me dead in my tracks. I'm frozen there like a rabbit or a deer frozen in headlights. I literally cannot get myself to move forward or take a step. An absolutely just overwhelming sense of dread sweeps over my body and presses on my chest. Something that I'm yet to experience again, but I literally feel like I'm about to die. I still can't move and sit there terrified as I feel a massive presence come up behind me. And whatever it was, this thing felt huge and very much real, and yet I can't seem to get away. I'm still stuck and helpless. I keep standing there too scared to turn around, unable to move, when the hairs on the back of my neck instantly stand up. It bends down, looms towards me, and right next to my ear says, "Yoo-hoo." And I kid you not that when I heard that, I ran faster than I have in my entire life. I tore up that hill, still too afraid to see what was behind me. I got in the car, slammed the door, and, like in a movie, went drive to my mum. My mum looks at me in disbelief and goes, "Is everything okay?" And I just say, "Drive." She told me later that I was pale white and that the sense of urgency in my voice just told her that she had to get away from whatever it was that I was scared of. But what spooks me so much about this story is that I never actually turned around. It felt so real though that it could have been a person, but I was right against the overlook. I don't think it could have snuck up behind me like that. I've also gotten a similar sense of dread visiting other haunted places too, and I really felt like it was something paranormal. As for the yoo-hoo, it didn't sound male or female, to be honest, but what it did sound was mean, as if it was trying to scare me or intimidate me. I've had a few paranormal experiences, but this one certainly takes the cake for the scariest. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I would love to hear your thoughts if you have some as to what it might have been, but as for me, I won't be going back there anytime soon, that's for sure.
Abandoned buildings, ghost towns, and homes away from home that have something terribly wrong with them. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on Twitter at DarkPrevails to catch updates on my upcoming card game and see me talk about my favorite shields. Today I've got some creepy urban exploration stories that will bring us to old schools, strange homes, and demon-infested ghost towns. Enjoy, and don't forget to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them on the show. Also, go to eeriecast.com for more scary shows like this that you can enjoy for free. Now, let's begin. Schools scared us the most. From Anonymous. Back in high school and early college, my friends and I used to explore abandoned buildings and stretches of land in our free time. I'll be using fake names for the sake of privacy. Our group consisted of 5 people. Will, who often wouldn't show up, Jake, who drove us everywhere, John, my best friend in the group, Anna, Jake's girlfriend, and me. Before Anna came into the picture, I'd been the only girl, and as a very small girl, I was always eager to prove that I wasn't easily scared, even though I was. We went and explored places all over the southeastern US. Some of our favorite places being mental hospitals or funeral homes. When I talk about it now, people always assume those places were the scariest. But they weren't. The scariest places ended up being the schools, hands down. In all the other places we went, trudging across the sewer-like basements of mental hospitals, climbing over coffins and through hearses in funeral homes, finding dried blood on farming equipment and old barns, none of it compared to the fear and dread that came with entering these 2 abandoned schools. Both these schools were in our hometown, one downtown and one midtown. I'll start with the one in midtown. We actually went to this one during the day. The police mostly camped out those places at night, so we were less likely to get caught during the day. There were some homeless people outside the building, but we managed to sneak around them just fine, and they had no clue we'd gotten inside the building. We had rules in our adventuring group. Rule number 1, no vandalism. We never broke into any place we went. If we couldn't find an already open way in, we turned around and went somewhere else. Rule number 2, keep quiet. We did not want to alert anyone that we were there at all. Our purpose was to have fun exploring and to take cool pictures for Instagram. And rule number 3, before we could have fun exploring, we had to clear the building. That usually meant Jake, or if Will was there, Jake and Will, going through the building with a flashlight and investigating every room, every closet and cupboard, any place where a creature or person could be hiding out of sight. As we got more experienced, we would have walkie-talkies and would all fan out, everyone clearing at once with a flashlight and a weapon. No guns, just blunt objects or knives, in the rare case that we'd have to defend ourselves. We never did have to use them. Both of these occurrences were fairly early on in our career of exploring. We entered the Midtown School, which wasn't insanely dilapidated compared to some other places we visited. We could hear the homeless people outside talking, so we made sure to keep our voices down as Jake and Will cleared the building's first floor. Everything was good, so John, Anna, and I began to explore the floor, while the other two continued to clear upstairs. Then they let us know that everything up there was good too. So after seeing everything there was to see downstairs, we headed up. The upstairs floor wasn't anything particularly special. There were classrooms and offices, and a little alcove at the end of the hall with a metal ladder leading up to the roof. The whole floor had already been cleared, but we all swept through the rooms again, looking for anything of interest. The rooms were pretty bare except for some old papers, desks, and chairs, and it was clear from the intact windows that it could not have been abandoned very long. That's important to note. None of the windows were broken, none of them were hanging open. They all were fully intact. We ended up going up to the roof, being careful not to be too visible or too loud up there. We had some fun and took some cool pictures. Then Jake, Will, and I, in that order, descended the metal ladder back into the second floor. When we got down, the three of us all froze. We had heard something that sounded like shuffling footsteps in one of the classrooms to our left, just a few doors down. Will and I whisper-yelled up to John and Anna not to come down, to just wait a minute and stay quiet, while Jake moved forward with his weapon to investigate the room. Will and I were ready to run in and help him if needed, our eyes focused on the door he disappeared through. The door he went through was to one of those big classrooms that had two entry doors, one at the front of the class and one at the back. He'd gone in the back door, and we heard him moving around and through, opening the closets loudly to try to scare the intruder out, if there was one. At this point, we weren't hiding our presence. Whoever was there had definitely heard us, and the fact that they weren't showing themselves meant it was either another person exploring just like us, or a homeless person who didn't like confrontation. We could still hear all the same voices outside, so we doubted it was a homeless person, which arguably worried us more. After a minute or two, Jake emerged from the farther door at the front of the classroom and began walking back towards us, the back door still ajar. He started to speak, something along the lines of, "No one's in there, come on." But he was cut off as the back door he'd left ajar, the one between us and Jake, slammed shut violently. It had been all the way open, not cracked, and it swung as though someone had thrown it. Jake was at least 10 feet away from it, and Will and I were even farther. Both Jake and Will immediately ran to the door, yanking it open and calling out, "Who's in there?" But I knew no one was, or at least no one that we could see. The windows were shut, so it wasn't wind. There was no air conditioning because there was no power. No one was near it. Jake had just cleared the room, and as they cleared it a second time, it became clear to Will and I that we'd seen something we truly couldn't explain, something we believed to be paranormal. We left soon after, mine and Will's nerves on edge. A couple of weeks after that, we went to the downtown school at night. Not our smartest choice, but we were young and not too bright. The school had all kinds of forum posts made about it, ranging from people seeing pairs of red eyes staring back at them from the back of the auditorium if you stood on the stage, to stories of the janitor hanging himself in the basement. We didn't really know what was true and what wasn't, but we showed up hoping to find out. Jake didn't believe in ghosts at all. Will and I did, though Will was much less respectful of them than I was. Anna did, or at least I think she did, based on how this particular night went. I'm not sure where John stood on all of it, probably somewhere in the middle. We found a lot of cool stuff in the school, including some old tape recordings of students, elementary school age, talking about how sad they were that the school was closing and what they would miss. It was a creepy kind of cool. After debunking the red eyes post we'd read, what we ended up seeing was just two little lights that for some reason never went off at the back of the auditorium. We headed for the basement, It turned out the basement had been the library. Books and shelves were scattered all over the floor, with a suspiciously large empty area in the center of the room where the janitor supposedly died. Will asked all of us to turn out our lights so he could try to talk to the ghost of the janitor, which, after some convincing, we all did. At first, Will was just going to coax the spirit to talk to us, but after getting no response, he began mocking it and cursing at it. John and I told him to chill out, but he kept going, amused by it. Anna began to cry into Jake's shoulder, clearly wanting it all to stop, and eventually, Will gave up and turned his light back on. That blows. Let's get out of here," he said. But as he turned toward the stairs, we all heard it. A low, sad moaning coming from the stairwell. Prior to this, we had cleared the entire building, and the only way in we'd found had been by climbing up and through a second-story window. This voice, however, sounded frail, like maybe it was hurt. No one like that could have entered the building, especially not without making enough noise to alert us all. We froze, listening as the moaning continued and was joined by a dragging sound, like something being lugged up the stairs and thumping on each step. Will, excited at this, ran forward and flashed his light up the stairs. Immediately, the sounds ended. He and Jake led the way after the sound, trying to find where the person had gone, clearing the rooms as they went. But they found no one. John and I looked out the windows as we continued, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be running away from the building, but we didn't see anybody. Out of all the places we went, all the decay we saw, the souls in the schools scared us the most. Ghost Town Creatures, from Money Be Good. One May, my husband, my 8-year-old granddaughter, and I took a long weekend camping trip to a popular state park a few hours away. I planned a variety of fun things to do, including a drive to a ghost town, which I discovered on the map while planning the trip. I couldn't find much information on the ghost town from Google, and that made it even more intriguing. We set up camp fairly early on the first day, deciding to start our adventure with the ghost town first. We mapped the coordinates on our GPS, and off we went. The 2-lane mountain road winded up and up, deeper and deeper, until the sun was blocked out by trees. Eventually, it became a 1-lane road, and all signs of civilization began to get farther and farther apart, until there was basically no trace. We were chatty and excited to get up there, wondering what it was going to be like. We drove for miles with no signs of life, or human life for that matter. My husband began to get a little concerned over this. We did have our granddaughter with us after all, and we were venturing into the middle of nowhere. The what-ifs started when the road went from a 1-lane paved road to a much slimmer gravel road that barely fit our truck. If another vehicle would come from the other direction, we'd be in trouble, because the road ran along the mountain cliff with no guardrails and nowhere to pull over or turn around safely. Our excitement diminished and concern lay thick in the air. Eventually, though, after a much longer drive than anticipated, we came to a stop sign at the end of the gravel road. The trees ended and the sun shone bright again. The road continued onto a 2-lane road, and aside from still no signs of human life anywhere, we all breathed a sigh of relief. Then the GPS told us to take the next right, and we'd be at our destination. As soon as we turned off that road, we were once again on a 1-lane gravel road, and immediately saw the old town. The old weathered gray buildings were quite a sight. We parked and we all got out of the truck. We also took our 2 dogs with us, a large chocolate lab and a feisty Australian shepherd. These dogs immediately were on point, pulling us towards the town, but I soon noticed that the Aussie's hackles went up. Even so, we explored the main road. All the while, I felt watched. One particular house came into view that was much newer than the older buildings, and this house looked as though someone actually could be living in it still. As we approached it, I noticed the front door was wide open, and then I thought I saw movement inside when my granddaughter suddenly asked me if anyone lived there. I said, "I think so. I mean, it looks like someone does." In my mind, I was thinking maybe it was the caretaker of the ghost town, if there was such a thing. We walked past the house and a creepy broken swing set, and right into the heart of this ghost town. The streets were lined with old gray buildings, some standing tall and others caved in. I snapped a few photos, but couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. Hubby said he was going to get some window shots of a few of the buildings, curious to see what was inside. I told my husband I didn't want to venture in any farther. Though we both had our concealed carry licenses and were both armed, me with a 9mm and him with a 1911, I still felt unsafe. I felt worse and worse about having my granddaughter out here. All of a sudden, a wave of uneasiness came over me. I just wanted to leave. He was on and off the porches snapping photos inside the buildings when the Aussie began making a low grumble, staring towards the upper windows of the porch he was standing on. I yelled to him, "Okay, I'm done. Let's go." And I began to walk back toward the truck. He jogged back and joined us, and as we passed the newer house again, I noticed the front door was now closed. My granddaughter saw it too, and said it out loud. Just then, our Aussie went nuts. She almost got away from me, launching towards that house, snarling, growling, making sounds I never heard her make before. The lab was on alert, hackles up too, her eyes darting back and forth, as the town steadily grew farther behind us. We all then climbed back in the truck and decided to find a different way back, rather than that long, windy, one-lane quad trail we came in on. Later that evening, after we tucked our granddaughter into her bed in the camper, my husband and I sat by the fire, going over the pics we took that day. When he came to his window pics, his smile waned. He began zooming in on them one by one and, with fear in his eyes, handed the phone to me. Very clearly in the photos were short, light gray creatures, large heads, large black eyes. On the forehead and on the sides of the head were small nubs or possibly small button-type horns. One looked to have wings, and the wings were lined with nubs as well. As I scrolled through the photos, all I could think of was what could have happened to us. Our precious granddaughter was with us there, and it could have gotten really ugly had these things decided to attack us. Luckily, though, they didn't. They stayed hidden inside those old buildings and never bothered us. I wonder who or what was in the newer house. Was it also one of those things, or a human who lived among them? Possibly a homeless person who stumbled across this place, not knowing what lurks outside the walls he chose to make his temporary home. Will he be making it out of the ghost town tomorrow? My questions went on and on, but I never did get answers, and I never will go back. I've included one zoomed photo. This was the pic taken of the upper window just as the Aussie began to growl. We never saw anything while there, but it was very bright and the windows had a glare, as you can see in this pic. Narrator's note. For those listening on the podcast, you can see the photo for yourself at darkstories.org in the pinned story titled Ghost Town Creatures. I'll keep it pinned for the next week or so. But don't get your hopes up. To me, I can certainly see an odd figure in the window, but it could very well be smudges on the glass, and there's not nearly as much detail as mentioned by the author of the story. Still, quite a fun tale, and it's always extra creepy to get a photo along with it. Undream House from Linda 007. The closing date had finally arrived for our dream house. My husband and I had bought a beautiful home in the mountains, fulfilling a lifelong dream of escaping the city, to be able to hear the sound of wind blowing through Ponderosa and nothing else. I've always thought I lived in the wrong place, quite possibly pursued the wrong jobs that kept me in the city. I was so eager to see our new home, so since my husband was working, I packed up my things, took my dog, Y, and set out by myself. It was a long drive from where we were living. I stopped at the title company, signed off on the last few papers, and unceremoniously was given keys to the house. My dog hopped into the back of the SUV, and we headed onto the highway as dusk was settling in. The house was remote, no cell phone service, so I made a call to my husband while I did have reception to report everything was in order. Back then, it was the start of the COVID lockdown stuff, and I was only just then understanding its effects. I remember telling my husband that I would stay at a hotel that night, since we haven't moved anything into the house yet, and when he told me everything was closed, I didn't believe him at first. But it turned out everything was closed, including the hotel, and the reservations I had were canceled. So at that point, my only option was to go to the house, which had no furniture, but I was still excited about it. The property itself was some 40 acres in the Rocky Mountains, located deep into the National Forest, at about 7,000 feet elevation. It was a historic home, about 100 years old, and recently completely renovated, though there were some oddities such as no real master bedroom. It had a meadow, a trickling, gurgling creek, a pond, forest, and spectacular silence. There was a little snow on the ground at the time, but not too icy. The road to the house was beginning to look familiar to me, as in it already felt like home. Once I was off the highway, it was a 45-minute drive. Y and I arrived as dusk was deepening. This was the first time I'd been on the property without being chaperoned by a realtor. I realized I didn't know how to operate the door locks, but I finally got in. The previous occupant had completely moved out, of course, as when I'd first seen the place, there was still a lot of knickknacks, but now it appeared nothing had been left behind. I recall them even having some disturbing-looking artwork, but that was all gone too. That did remind me of something that happened, though. When seeing the place with the realtor at one point tapped me on the arm and nodded towards a painting in the corner. At first glance, I thought it was a guy walking with his dog, but on closer inspection, it was a guy carrying a goat head. Weird. I'm glad that one was gone in particular. I noted there was a spotlight in that corner that must have illuminated the painting, but to my surprise, I couldn't find a switch to turn it off. The silhouette of the painting could still be seen as the wall was faded around it. Y made the rounds of our new place, upstairs, bathrooms, closets, and now was ready to go. He stood in the entryway and whined. "We're not leaving, silly. We're staying here tonight." I grabbed a few things from the SUV and locked the doors. I didn't even have a sleeping bag, but with a few blankets and my pillow, being so tired, I would be asleep in no time. As I closed my eyes, I was aware that Y sat by me at full attention. He seemed to be panting nervously. It's just a new place, I told myself. I did fall asleep, but I was eventually awakened by the sound of banging coming from the basement. It sounded as if someone was banging a metal pipe with another metal pipe. Maybe it was just the heating system. I tried to go to sleep again. I became aware that the outdoor lights, which had motion detectors, kept turning on and off, and that metal banging just went on. Y would intermittently bark, but then return to his watchful pose right next to me. By 3 a.m., I was completely unnerved by the banging and decided to drive back home. I got dressed, fumbled with the door locks again, but finally got it secured and left. Overhead, the Milky Way shone brightly, the first time I'd ever actually seen it, thanks to the lack of light pollution out here. My husband and I made a few trips to our dream house in the mountains. Due to COVID, though, our plans for the future changed slightly, and we soon decided we weren't ready to retire, so we wouldn't be moving so soon. Still, we'd have the house out there waiting for us, and we did enjoy staying there on temporary occasions, but it seemed that house had different plans for us. Slowly, odd things began to happen. I never did hear the banging in the basement again. When my husband and I inspected the heating system, only the heating manifold was metal, being made of brass. The rest of it was flexible plastic tubing, so I had no idea how that sound was made. We would awaken some mornings to find the cabinet doors open in the kitchen. Now, altogether, we have 1 German Shepherd and 2 Malinois. At night, all the dogs piled onto the bed with us and wouldn't budge until dawn. At home, they slept in different places, but usually not the bed. They also were exuberant about going outside, so if you only hinted at opening the door, there would be 3 eager faces ready to burst through. As I worked around the property during the day and explored it, I made some disturbing discoveries. A marble statue in a remote corner and evidence of a recent campfire, which worried me that local kids might have done it and risked starting a fire on our land. Closer to the house, and some overgrown weeds I was trying to knock down, I found several life-sized plaster human-looking heads on wooden pedestals. The plaster looked familiar as the previous homeowner had several art projects made from it. As I worked outside, I would stop and admire our home, which was, I thought, so beautiful when we first bought it, but now was taking on a more foreboding look. There was a stone arch under the deck in front of the house that looked like a frown. After a year of owning the house, we decided to sell it mainly for work reasons. The many odd things that happened there made me reluctant to stay by myself if my husband should go out of town. We made sure we kept an open Bible in the upstairs great room, a suggestion from an elder at church. On our last night there, the dogs piled onto the bed as usual. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up to find the front door wide open, which I had personally checked on before going to bed. More concerning is that when I got up to close the door, none of the dogs would budge from the bed. That was the last time I ever saw that house. About a year later, through the grapevine, I heard that it completely burned down. Luckily, no one was injured. As for me, I didn't even feel sad about the news. There was something not quite right about the place. I do think there was some sort of entity occupying that space and time, clearly with a dark side, and I think the dogs could sense it. I don't believe it was a lingering spirit from someone who had died at the home at some point. I think instead it was some sort of entity conjured by the previous owner. Maybe it was disoriented that we didn't live there full time. I feel lucky we were able to detach ourselves from it, and apart from a few scary stories, it can never affect us again. The Abandoned Courthouse. From Danny G01. My friends and I experienced one of the scariest things possible, and I wanted to share it with you. We're currently working in South Texas, far away from my home in California. With our whole crew being between 19 to 32 years old, we love to explore any city we were called to. When we learned of an abandoned courthouse in town, we were psyched to go see for ourselves. We picked a Friday night where we knew we wouldn't have to work the next day, geared up with flashlights and pocket knives, and set out at around 11:30 p.m. Upon arriving, we noticed the whole building was fenced up. We drove around a couple of times, trying to scope out a sneaky entrance. We also noticed every window and door was boarded up on the ground floor, so entering the place was not going to be easy. After parking a few blocks away to not make anything suspicious, we walked to a spot under a bridge overpass, where we thought it would be easy to get past the fence. And sure enough, we managed to make it past the fence without much of a problem. We began to explore around the building, looking for any openings to get through the boarded windows or doors. Being this close to the building, we got some very eerie vibes from it. The creepy statues surrounding the place, the vines growing on the sides of the building, the darkness of the entire property. It all really had my heart racing. There were at least 2 windows that had the word "Help" on the boards covering them. Goosebumps covered my arms after seeing that. We finally picked a window to try and pry open with our pocket knives. We successfully managed to unscrew 6 screws from the board with our knives, but 2 of them wouldn't budge. My coworker, Rob, began to pull on the board to no success. After a lot of fidgeting and kicking the board, making way too much noise, it caved and we finally had an opening. Immediately, we noticed graffiti on the wall of the room we just broke into. It read, Diablo, in dark red spray paint. Just from being in that room, we could see the whole place was trashed. There were 3 different doorways to pick from to start exploring the building inside that room. We chose the middle doorway, heading to the center of the building. As we saw from the main room, there was trash all over, but a small red light caught all of our attention. After looking at the light closely, we realized it was a motion sensor. We cautiously left that room, keeping a close eye out for more motion sensors. We tried the 3rd room only to find more of them. After a lot of discussion whether we should just leave or try the 1st room, one of my coworkers began walking to the 1st doorway, so we followed. There we found some stairs and fuse boxes completely cut, and luckily no motion sensors yet. The room was blocked with trash, but there was another doorway. My coworker, Brian, walked to the doorway first and stopped immediately. We thought he may have found another motion sensor, but he said something very odd. He said there were at least 8 chairs in a perfect circle. He then noted that they were very clean, not a single speck of dust on them. That was very odd, as the place was quite old, trashed, and dusty. We then realized we may have stumbled upon a cult circle. I started walking to see for myself, but I was interrupted by a lot of shushing. I stood there puzzled, but then I heard a faint alarm sound. We knew these rooms we were walking into had no motion sensors. We had been checking as we walked. We noped out of there as quickly as we could. After making it to the truck safely, we were all talking about it, and we came to one conclusion. As we were kicking down the window board to enter, we probably interrupted the cultists during their ritual, and as we got closer to them, they left their circle to hide, tripping a motion sensor. We didn't know who or what tripped it, and we definitely did not want to stick around and find out. Thank you for listening to another unsettling episode of Unexplained Encounters. You can send us your story to have it narrated on the show at darkstories.org. Unexplained Encounters is an EerieCast original series. You can find other horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com, such as Redwood Bureau, a fictional anthology series, Freaky Folklore, a documentary-style series about myths and cryptids around the world, Destination Terror, a show about the most haunted places, and Tales from the Break Room, another show I host all about the scary things that happen to people at work. Again, that's eeriecast.com. By the way, if you want fewer annoying ads and you want to support what we do, consider going to eeriecast.com/plus to sign up for EerieCast Plus. That unlocks all our podcasts with all but host-read ads removed. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.